that members of this committee have a working knowledge of this issue. Many of you have spoken to me privately and have spoken to others about your concern about the testing load that is in our schools and how it's being implemented. So we wanted her to give us an overview and really use this opportunity for you to ask detailed questions that you know of her, so we can regroup, and if it's the pleasure of this committee to do legislation to address this, we will do like we did last year. We will look at it and we will propose collaboratively, and this is your committee. So I'm going to turn it over to the commissioner, but I would ask that at any given point, if you had questions, just try to signal me and I'll recognize you. With that, Commissioner.
Thank you very much, Chair Legg, and thank you, Senators. I appreciate the opportunity to be before you and hope that I can prove to shed some light on this issue and answer any questions that you may have. This first slide talks about the statewide standardized assessment program and what it is designed to do. And so when we are looking at what we administer at the state level, it is to determine the achievement levels as well as the learning gains each year of students in English language arts and mathematics, and then the achievement level on the other subject areas that are administered at the state level. It's used to look at what the strengths and weaknesses are of the students and be able to adjust instruction accordingly, and look at whether or not students should move to the next grade level, and then whether or not they should be able to graduate from high school. Very often, the information from the assessments is used to make decisions at the local level, but also at the state level. It is used for school accountability or school grades and for recognition. And then when we look at the need for work in improving schools, we look at locally, districts are able to see whether or not they have met the goals that they have set. And then we look at that at the state level and determine how are we doing as a state, where do we need to adjust. And we also do comparisons at the national level, and more recently we've done some great comparisons at the international level. And then that informs very often programs and policies that you all may want to make, or as well as the State Board of Education may want to adjust. So what are the required assessments? State law that you all put into place, it requires the mandatory participation in the statewide standardized assessment program. All students participate in those programs that I mentioned. And we have to ensure that the assessment is in fact aligned to the standards. You don't want a situation where you're teaching one thing and then assessing students on something else. So those are on the English language arts, grades 3 through 11. Mathematics, we have grades 3 through 8. Science, grades 5 and 8. And then the end of course assessments in Algebra 1, Geometry, Algebra 2, Biology, U.S. History, and Civics. That's the reason that mathematics is grades 3 through 8, is because we then take up the mathematics and of course exams of Algebra 1, Geometry, and Algebra 2. Sometimes those being taken as early as the middle school. And then in state law, we also have the alternative assessment, the Florida alternate assessment, and it's given to those students with disabilities whose IEP indicates that that is the most appropriate assessment for those students. In addition, the statewide standardized assessments do satisfy the federal law requiring assessments in English language arts, mathematics, and also in science. So the state requires certain uses for that standardized assessment results. For students, a student that does not achieve a level 2 in the 3rd grade is not promoted to the 4th grade without one of the 6 good cause exemptions that are provided in law. And you may recall that grade 10 English Language Arts assessment is required in order to graduate from high school for a student who is earning a standard diploma. Students can satisfy that requirement through a concordant score on the SAT or ACT. In addition, students must pass Algebra 1 in order to be able to graduate from high school. But again, there is a comparable score that can be derived on the PERT in order to meet that graduation requirement of the Algebra 1. And then a student that is enrolled in any of those courses that have a statewide standardized EOC, as I mentioned on the previous slide, the results are to count 30% of the student's grade in that course. In addition, those students that don't score at least a level 3 on the standardized test must be provided with diagnostic assessments. That's a requirement, a statewide requirement for students that don't score level 3 or higher. They would then participate in progress monitoring throughout the next year. The required uses at the school and district level is that the achievement level and learning gains are used in the school accountability system or the school grading system. And in addition, for those schools that are alternative schools that select a school improvement rating, that assessment is used for that purpose as well. And then the results are also used to provide those schools that are in need of improvement also have to provide progress monitoring. That's an additional state requirement of assessment. And then for teachers who are teaching courses that the standardized assessment is aligned to, the growth of those students is included in the performance of their students section of their performance evaluation. Computer-based testing. We certainly know that we have been working on computer-based testing since 2010-11 school year. And in that first year, there were 5 assessments that were delivered on the computer. This last school year, 13-14, 14 of the statewide assessments were given on the computer. And you see those subjects and grade levels that are listed there. In 14-15, in addition to the ones that were administered on the computer in 13-14, you'll see that we'll be adding 5th grade English Language Arts, but not the writing portion of English Language Arts. And then grades 7 and 8 mathematics will be given on the computer. In addition, the new 11th grade English Language Arts assessment, as well as the Algebra 2 EOC, those 2 will also be delivered on the computer for this school year. The additional grade levels will be added as we go along until the year 2017-18, when all assessments will be given on the computer. This is important, and I think this was one of the questions that came up earlier today. I provided sort of a quick answer to that this morning, but this provides a little more detail, and you see broken down by every single grade level on the English Language Arts, both the writing and reading components combined, as well as the mathematics assessment. When you look at the grade levels, most of them are given over 3 days. And you can see that the writing portion, we allow 90 minutes or an hour and a half. And for the reading, it is just over 2.5 hours total, not 2.5 hours per day, but 2.5 hours total. And then 3 hours in 9th, 10th, and 11th grade. And looking at math, it's very similar, you'll see. I do want to point out that we have provided a large window for the assessment. So while a student, let's take 3rd grade, for example. Students will be taking the test over 3 days. That's the individual student will sit for the exam for 3 days. The writing will be an hour and a half. The math will be just over 2.5 hours. and districts will choose the window during which they will take that test. So for writing, the student will be an hour and a half, and it's sometime over a 10-day window that the district will decide. For the reading portion, it's just over 2.5 hours, and there's a 20-day window that the district will decide which days each student will be assessed. This is similar for the EOCs. You can see there the amount of days and time and the length of the window. The window is very generous in order to make sure that we can get the assessment done. Here it is for our reading retakes and the elementary and middle school science, the grade 5 and grade 8 science assessment. This is an important slide to put into context how much time is spent on testing. When we look at the 07-08 year, the 13-14 year, and the 14-15 year. So let's look at third grade. When we look at third grade, the number of days in 07-08 was 5 days. The number of days for 13-14 was 4, and the number of days for 14-15 will also be 4 days. The total hours per grade level, so the total hours in third grade in 07-08 was 6.5 hours. In 13-14, it was just over 4.5 hours. And in 14-15, it will be just under 5.5 hours. So a student is sitting for the assessment for just under 5.5 hours.
Commissioner, if I can interrupt you here, can you provide some clarification? Because I know this morning's meeting and the questions I get, these days right here, which assessments are these? Is this the state level assessments, local assessments?
These are only the statewide assessments. So this is representing the English language arts and the mathematics statewide assessment.
Senator Gates.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just so that we are operating off the same set of numbers, is this number of days and number of hours that you've given, Commissioner, all of the statewide assessments or all of the state mandated assessments?
All of the statewide standardized assessments,
And so,
the ones that are administered by the state.
Mr. Chairman, if you add the state mandated assessments, the assessments that districts are required to give, either by picking from a menu or for some other reason, then what does the testing schedule look like?
Mr. Chair, President Gates, I have not been afforded the authority to dictate how long those locally, the state required locally administered assessments would be, so they would vary from district to district.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To disabuse us of the information we might be getting from some places, for example, provided to us as senators is one report that says 1% or less of instructional time is devoted to state mandated assessments. And in another case, a district, and it happened to be in my area, Bay County, reports that 7 of the last 9 weeks of the school year are devoted to state mandated assessments. How can we riddle through and find the truth?
Mr. Chair, President Gates, let me share this with you, that the 1% of instructional time is what you see on this chart. The 7 of the last 9 weeks would include the windows for the state standardized assessments that you saw on the previous slides.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If one is a student, or if one is a teacher, or one is a parent, the difference between a state mandated assessment and a statewide assessment is a difference that doesn't matter a whole lot because they have to take the test. and that's the time that is absorbed. Whether that time is well spent or not well spent is, you can get a lot of opinions about. But would you not agree that for the end user, the student, the parent, the teacher, the real metric here in terms of time is the time spent on state mandated assessments, not just the time spent on statewide assessments, if we're talking about time spent, and then one gets to the collateral issues after that?
Mr. Chair, if I may, the difference is that the statewide assessments, statewide standardized assessments, there is a set amount of time. The state mandated, it is left to the district to determine whether they give a 15-minute assessment or a 3-hour assessment.
Senator Dietrich.
Well, I'm so glad President Gates said what we're trying to do is find the truth of the matter, because we've heard this, probably all of us in our districts, all summer long, mainly from teachers and parents talking about the stress on the students of all the testing. And your 20 days, while only a couple of hours are going to be spent on a test, from what I see brought to me by teachers, it looks like, okay, we have our state mandated tests, and then, of course, you have the tests inflicted on everybody by the district for the pre-test test. Then you have the retakes, and if you had kids who were absent, they have to take the test. So when you're doing the test, the pre-test, the retakes, doesn't that take kids out of the classroom and pretty much disrupt the whole learning cycle? So it's really kind of more than just 2 or 3 hours, or am I incorrect on that?
This slide here is representing the statewide assessment. The other assessments that you referenced, some are state mandated, but how and when and how often they are administered is a local decision. And I'm happy to have the authority, and if the legislature wants to provide me with the authority, we can mandate that, we can monitor that, but right now that is left to the district to determine, and they are locally determining that.
Senator Dietrich.
Okay, as a follow-up, I would be happy to empower you to make those choices, and if we did empower you, would you somehow magically be able to reduce the testing process?
Chair Legg? I believe that assessment is very, very important. And I think that our statewide, what you see represented here, has served us very well in the state of Florida. If we want to become more prescriptive in that assessment program or in the monitoring along the way, the only way for us to do that and do so in a very standardized manner is for the legislature to prescribe what that would be.
Senator Mofford.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me weigh in on this just a moment, Commissioner. I'm not sure if it makes any difference who sets the schedule. The fact remains that these school districts are required to do these assessments and all the other assessments that are mandated by the state, 2 categories. The third category is what we call progress monitoring. And President Gates, I know something might have been you this morning, made a very good point that the teachers are going to want to know how well their students are doing before they take that high-stakes test. And keep in mind that teacher evaluations and pay now depend upon how well these students do on the exams. So I'm not sure if it makes much difference whether the commissioner makes a decision as to when or the school districts make the decision. The fact remains that if you look at what Florida, whether it comes from legislature or the district does it because it's a state mandate, or the districts do it because it's the progress monitoring piece, there is still a lot of testing that's going on. And one of the issues, and I'm sure we'll get to in a minute, is the whole issue of availability of the technology that either does or does not exist in these districts. But I think it would behoove us at some point, and I happen to have a sheet from one county somewhere, they have the testing calendar from August to June. And it lists very clearly the test, every test that has to be given, and whether it's a district test, district decision test, or state mandated test. And some of you may have seen those from your own districts. And I think it will clearly show that the vast, vast majority of these assessments that are being given in these districts are either state mandated or standardized tests, the vast majority of them. And so if you look at that, I think to me, that's what we have to focus on that. And let me hasten to say that I don't believe you'll find any school superintendent that wants to retreat, back up, or whatever. School districts believe in high assessment, high standards, rigorous standards, and being able to assess how their students are doing. So this is not, I wouldn't want you to misunderstand that this is an effort to try to retreat, if you will. It's more or less of let's have a clear realization of what is expected of these students and these teachers in the districts. And let's get to it and let's find out exactly what those are, who mandates those, is there something we can do, are there some exams that we can, and I'm getting too far off base here, but I'll save that to the end, Mr. Chair. But my point is that regardless of who makes the decision as to when and how long, there's still a lot of assessments that's been given.
Senator Benaquisto?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Stewart, I know that you've shared with us that you are only responsible for the tests and the duration that the statewide assessment. But it might be a rhetorical question, but has your team ever gone through the exercise of overlaying that with the exams and testing that the counties are doing? Because one of the counties that I serve does 164 or 168 of their own. And I'd like us to be looking at it from the big picture. Even though you can't, even though you're not responsible or don't have the authority over it, when we're looking at these decisions, we should be looking at the entirety of the experience for the child, which is, we're all here to serve the children. Have you ever done that exercise?
If I may, Chair. Senator, we are in the process of that investigation now, and that the more details on that investigation are a little later in the presentation, so if I can save it for that. But I do want to point out, in response to Senator Montford's comments, I agree that if I were a superintendent or a principal, I would want to know along the way how my students are doing. But I want us to be clear that the state requirement or state mandated assessments beyond the ones that are statewide standardized are what you see here on this slide, which is that when a student is not a level 3 or higher, there are to be diagnostic assessments administered. That is a state requirement. It is not prescriptive how long that will be, what instrument is to be used, but that is required by the state. And the other is schools that are identified in need of improvement are to progress monitor their students. So if a student is in a school that is not one in need of improvement and they scored a level 3, 4, or 5, the state does not require them to participate in progress monitoring. That's not a state requirement. The two requirements in state, that are state requirements in statute and in rule, are those students that did not score a 3, 4, or 5, no matter the school they're in, and the students in a school in need of improvement.
Commissioner, in hearing Senator Gates's question, there, obviously when it comes to the local assessments, we have a wide array of implementation. And while the state requires some of these assessments, and sometimes there is a distinction without a difference, do we have any database, any place to show, you know, the delta between Alachua County and you know, Pasco County? How do we know that some have limited days, more days? Is there any place where this committee can look at and say, here is the ones that have limited number of assessments or limited number of day seat times, and here's the ones that have an excessive amount? Does that exist, or could it exist?
Chairman Legg, I will share with you that by the time session begins, we will have that information. We provided the template to the districts for responding to those very questions on their local assessments. And we will have that by the end of the month, and then we will have that information to be able to provide to the legislature by the start of session.
Once, President Gates, if you don't mind, Senator Mumford had us there. Senator Mumford, and I'll go to Senator Gates.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm of the opinion, I would suggest to you, that if school districts only administered what is up here, what is state required, and a third piece that I'm about to add, regardless, if you were to remove all the progress monitoring, except for those that are required, you will still, I think, be surprised at how many assessments we do in this state. One piece that we haven't talked about is that school districts evaluate teachers. 50% of their evaluation is based on how well their students do on assessments. Now, you don't read up here anywhere that says school districts are required to do this. But school districts are required to evaluate teachers for their evaluation, for their decision whether or not they're rehired, and for the decision as to regarding performance pay. And the commission will show you up here in a few minutes, I assume, the 5 choices the school districts have. Number 5 is a lot of flexibility, and that is teacher-generated or district-generated tests. Now, quite frankly, I don't think we want teachers to be able to, if I'm teaching something, I'm not sure you want me administering, devising my own test to evaluate myself to give the student. I don't think that will work. So my point is, if you take this, you take what other is required by the state, plus what's required that districts must do to evaluate the teachers as we have prescribed that they do, you can forget the progress monitoring. You still have a lot of assessments. And I believe that's what we have to focus on. Commissioner, am I close?
Is that correct? In the form of a question.
I think that Senator Montford is correct in some people might be surprised at the amount of monitoring, progress monitoring, the amount of assessments. I think when I get into the local assessment portion, that may shed a little more light on that part of what Senator Montford talked about. But with regard to progress monitoring, I think that very often, particularly when they have level 1 and 2 students, they also want to know where the other students are along the year, during the year. And so they end up administering progress assessments, benchmark assessments, progress monitoring along the way to all of their students. I think that's accurate.
Senator Gates, and then we'll go back to the commissioner. Let her proceed down because we've got more sections that we want to kind of vet out some of these issues that we're going to be working on. So,
Thank you, Mr.
Senator
Chairman,
Gates.
and I'll be brief and succinct, at least I hope. Testing's a little like taxes, nobody likes it, but what people really want to know is, how's it being used? And I happen to believe in frequent and valid assessment. I happen to believe that measuring is good in taxes and in testing. But here's what troubles me, and I'd like to ask the Commissioner to comment briefly. We're after valid and reliable information. That's the value of assessment, be it formative or summative assessment. When we make the statement that some district administered but state mandated tests are 15 minutes long and others are 3 hours long, my question is, what kind of quality control is there on the reliability and validity of the testing and the data? If it's true that we can have a 15-minute test that's valid and reliable, either as a formative or a summative assessment, let's find those people who have that 15-minute test and let's replicate it across the state and give folks a little bit of relief. So is the department planning to do some sort of qualitative analysis that determines whether or not, with the flexibility that my DNA is all over it, giving local districts flexibility, with this flexibility, have we created a circumstance, Commissioner, where validity and reliability of the assessment results are open to question, or is there such a wide span that we can go to the 15-minute test and get valid and reliable results and therefore lift a good share of the testing burden?
If I may, Chair. In order to accomplish that, I do believe, again, that there would have to be statutory change to provide that authority.
Authority to develop an opinion?
No, sir, not to develop an opinion, but to monitor, as you asked, to qualitatively monitor. And I apologize that I used an example of 15 minutes.
No, it's
3
okay.
hours. We currently do not require that. It is not laid out in statute. So there is no guidelines, there is no requirement. So I used it for points of making the point that we don't control that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner, if we can, there's other sections and components that
Absolutely.
we're going to need to at least digest and vet out some of the concerns here
Sure.
to start with. So if we can move on and
Happy to
we'll
move along.
get some more questions.
These are other required statewide administered assessments or created for statewide purposes. And this first one is the Florida Kindergarten Readiness Screener. And this is required for kindergarten students within the first 30 days of school. We also have what we call the SELA. It is the assessment for English language learners, and it is to measure the language acquisition of our ELL students. And then the National Assessment of Educational Progress is administered to a sample of students in selected grade levels every other year. So the last time we have it is from 2013, and it provides us with the ability to do national and state-by-state comparisons. And then we have the PERT assessment, which is the post-secondary readiness assessment, and it is required of 11th grade students to determine whether or not they need to be placed in a college or career readiness course in the 12th grade. And the other is the PSAT and the plan, which is in state law to be administered to 10th graders in public high schools. And the parent does have the opportunity for this assessment to exempt his or her child. This is the only statewide assessment that parents may exempt their children from. Here is what Senator Montford referred to earlier. These are the locally determined required assessments, and these are in statute required at the local level. It is the local responsibility of the local school districts for the development of these assessments. And districts have choices for what those local assessments would be. They can use a statewide assessment for those courses that are aligned to the statewide assessments. And then there can also be standardized assessments that are nationally recognized as standardized assessments. We all have familiarity with those. And then there are industry certification assessments that can be used where it appropriately aligns with those courses. Or it can be a district-developed or district-selected end-of-course assessment. And the last, as Senator Montford had pointed out, provides the most flexibility, and this can be teacher-selected or principal-selected assessments. And I want to be sure that we understand there that it is teacher-selected or principal-selected assessments, does not say end of course. That's the bullet before that is the only place that it references an actual end of course, sit down, paper, pencil, or computer assessment. It even goes on in statute to describe those to be performance-based. They could even be adjudicated assessments. So you could have your choral or band adjudicated assessments that might in fact stand in the place. It could be project-based, it could be portfolio, but something that determines whether or not a student has mastery of the course. So we have an item bank and test platform, and we provided technical assistance to school districts that was required in statute, and we have done that. Districts have participated in developing items to go into that test item bank. We provided training on how to write high-quality items and how to put together a high-quality test from high-quality assessments. And starting this past summer, districts began creating assessments from that item bank. They don't go into the item bank without being aligned to the Florida standards or the next generation standards or the frameworks for those career and technical courses. Each district does create their own assessments. The tool will tell them if they have enough assessment or enough items on particular standards. And we have had reports from districts that what they've been able to do through this item bank is remove older unaligned assessments they had to be able to use the item bank and actually have assessments that are aligned to the standards that are rich, good assessments.
Commissioner, let's just take a break here. I know we had some other questions, but I think it's appropriate. Senator Sobel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. President Gates referred to a 15-minute test. I'm just wondering why the new testing is longer. Why was there a necessity to increase the amount of time spent on this new FCAT?
The Florida Standards Assessment does include performance items. And so if we looked back at that chart that I had, when we look at 0708, in most instances, it's actually less time than we gave that assessment in 0708. And in 0708, we had performance items. Performance items are more authentic testing. They better align to the kind of instruction that students receive. And so while in some instances it is more than the assessment was in 13-14, in many instances it's actually less than it was in the 0708 school year.
Senator Sobel.
Isn't there a way to take parts of that test that were previously there and reduce that part to add these new assessments?
If I may, Chair, you're probably into an area that we would need to have some person who is very experienced in text construction and the ability to have valid and reliable assessments, but you have to have a certain number of items on an assessment in order to actually know whether or not a student has acquired that knowledge.
Follow. So could you tell me if the local tests given are easier or harder than the statewide tests?
Chair Legg? We don't have a way of knowing that. We don't know the local assessments. We don't see the local assessments, so we don't know.
Because when Senator Montford related the fact that teacher performance is related to testing, it's probably driving the testing because they don't want their kids to fail the statewide assessment, so they test them locally. And I'm not sure if those tests are harder because they want to, maintain their jobs. So this whole testing and student and teacher performance is driving, I think, some of this increase in testing.
Recognize.
With regard to what those assessments are, certainly a superintendent has the jurisdiction to be able to determine or standardize that across their district. So if a superintendent wanted to make that standardized, they certainly could.
Senator Montford, you had a question?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner, I'm not sure you're through yet, but.
I'm not.
Okay, all right. We're going to get to technology later.
We are.
Okay. But then, somewhere I miss mentioning that, and I'm not sure what the number is, Commissioner, in the statute that says they'll be monitored or assessed every grade, every subject. And we have discussed before, I believe if you're a superintendent sitting out there and you read it, every grade, every subject, that means every grade, every subject. Would you agree with that? I mean, has there been any flexibility with that? And then if so, how do we get that message out? Because we're not talking about a handful of districts having issues here. I mean, this is statewide. We've got the same issues popping up, whether it's an urban, mid-size, or rural district. It's the same issues coming up. And I think if we can get to the point where we can really clarify exactly what do we really mean by every grade, every subject, whether it be kindergarten or ninth grade.
Let me do two things. Senator Montford, my presentations today, this is my third one, and they were beginning to run together. And I did talk about the computer-based testing earlier. And one of the points on there was that by 17-18, the school year 17-18, they would all be delivered online. With regard to the every course, every grade, that is what is required on this slide. And I believe in this last legislative session, in the 2014 legislative session, that great deal of flexibility, that most flexible bullet down there at the bottom was what was added to statute. And we provided technical assistance. We did our roadshow of our legislative update, and I am open to suggestions as to how we could better get the messages out. It's not just that message, but it's several messages. We have monthly superintendent calls. We put it in our weekly updates. We did travel the state. We provided technical assistance. You are absolutely accurate. I don't know that message is out there, and I am open to suggestions of ways we can get the message out.
Paula, briefly, we have some other questions coming. So.
Okay. Real briefly, then, the last item, the teacher selected, principal selected assessments, was that not the one that we passed last session?
Yes.
And that will expire June 30th of this year?
I don't believe that expires. It does not expire.
Doesn't. So that's forevermore. Okay.
Unless the legislature changes it.
I got it. Okay.
Senator Benaquisto.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You spoke about the time that is allotted in windows for schools to conduct testing, and then we have layered upon that the district mandated or approved testing. But not every student in every class is taking the test at the same time. Having a daughter in public school in the 10th grade, I get reports about all the movies that they watch, and that is no disrespect to anyone, but when all these tests are going on in the school as a unit, but not all the students are taking the test, how can we guarantee that the students who are not getting tested at that time are participating in purposeful instruction so that their time is not being wasted while other kids are taking tests?
Chair. I'm not exactly sure how to do that. I certainly don't think that there's any one of us or any educator that wants there to be down instructional time. We can certainly work with districts to try to help them with how to develop a schedule such that there is the least amount of interruption to instructional time, or how to be creative in that instruction. And I think then there are ways that you can still provide instruction, even if some students are pulled out for assessment, and still provide instruction in the classroom rather than having movies.
Senator Bullard, I'll recognize you, then we're going to let the commissioner can move on to the other one, but you haven't asked a question yet. Senator Bullard.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Commissioner. My question is sort of having to deal with instructional time as well, and as it relates to the percentage of district and teacher evaluations related to testing. So in the previous chart, when you showed the amount of hours spent testing, I would assume that that is taken from the overall 900 hours of instructional time required under statute, right? So out of the 900 total hours, that is how many hours are dedicated to that particular realm of test. Yes?
That's correct.
All right. That being said, as a teacher, I'm always concerned about academic freedom and the autonomy to teach the course that I'm instructed to teach. So let's say I have a book, outside resources, et cetera. Do we have an idea or a handle on how instructional time for a teacher is impacted when, let's just pull out 11th grade, because that's what I've normally taught. So it says there that 4.5 hours out of my 11th grade curriculum were spent on assessments. Some of those English language, some maybe district, et cetera. If I'm the teacher teaching from the book, trying to enrich the students with a plethora of information on the subject, that 4.5 hours is now 51% of my evaluation, potentially, as well as nearly half of the district's evaluation. How or why would I go the extra mile to create an enriching environment if basically what I'm hearing, in my understanding, is that potential 4.5 hours could be the determining factor in whether or not I'm employed or not next year? What's the point in me going and teaching to the best of my ability as opposed to streamlining my curriculum to just focus in on that 4.5 hours?
Senator Bullard, I believe very strongly that teachers can be very creative and enriching in teaching the standards that are there for students. And I think in so doing, their students will perform best in those 4.5 hours if they are providing that enriched, high-quality instruction that is aligned to the standards.
Just quick follow-up?
Quick follow-up, then we need to move on.
And it's just really a food for thought, right? If we replace that statewide mandate with, let's say, the SAT, which we've all at some point in our life had to take, right? Or the ACT, and you were to put that, plaster the SAT right there, the question now becomes, should I spend time with SAT prep, or should I allow the child to go in and take the test cold? For most of us, we took SAT prep as an outside exercise of our normal classroom environment. But now when you factor in the potential of a grading of a district or evaluation of a teacher, it would seem as though the natural educational experience, organic educational experience, becomes undermined, and I go even as far as to say corrupted, potentially, by adding those components, those punitive components to it. So I would love if DOE, in your looking into what we're doing, could really go hard in looking at, have the punitive components of the statutory language that we currently have, you know, the high stakes, the standardized requirements, pieces of state law, undermined the organic potential of education. That's all.
If I may, Chair, I recognize that that may have been rhetorical, but I think I have an actual response to that. And that is that, in fact, what we have seen, and probably since the time that you took the SAT, our students in Florida are performing much better. And our students of poverty are performing much better than they ever had before or ever we thought they had the potential. So I would suggest to you that by doing this, we are actually ensuring precisely what you're hoping for.
Commissioner, if you can continue on your presentation, because I know there's some other points that I would like at least the members to
Oop, went
start to
on too far.
digest and ask questions on.
So we have just some additional assessment information. We have concordant opportunities. I mentioned it earlier that we have a concordant score on the SAT and one on the ACT for the FCAT 2.0. And the State Board of Education adopted that in the summer of 2013. And that stays in place. That concordant score stays in place through the transition to the new assessments until such time as we have enough concordant scores for the State Board to adopt new concordant scores. In addition, the State Board of Education, as per statutory requirement, the State Board of Education adopted rule exemptions for students with medical complexities. And they did so in their November 2014 meeting in plenty of time for us to be able to provide those exemptions for those medically fragile students. And I have already granted some of those. We are still receiving some, and they still have the opportunity to submit those, but we have already granted those exemptions. And then it is required at the state level that I have to establish schedules for the assessment, and by August of each year, I notify the districts in writing, and we put it on our website of what the assessment and then the reporting schedules are for the school year. And that has been on our website. It is reflected in some of those slides that you saw earlier in this presentation. And then we have to provide the absolute earliest reporting back to school districts as is possible. The local assessment schedule, this was new statutory requirement, and they must submit those to the department by October 1st of each year. And that brings me to the assessment investigation, and Senator Benaquisto, I think this will address some of your questions. We are in the process of conducting an investigation. I already mentioned that we sent the template out. Districts are responding to that this month, and we will be providing that information as session begins. And the districts will tell us what kinds of decisions are based on the test results. Do they use it for promotion? Do they use it to include in the course grade? Are they using it only for progress monitoring? And is it used at the district level for, how do they use the statewide standardized assessments? Why are they required to take that test? Senator Montford pointed out earlier that sometimes it is because the state requires it. And we know, as I mentioned earlier, that students that didn't score at least a level 3 must be progress monitored, and students in schools in need of improvement must be progress monitored. What grade levels are they giving that test to? Whether or not they provide the results to the teachers and the students and the parents. How much time does it take for each test? You saw the chart on the statewide standardized assessments. Well, we will look for something like that for the local assessments. And let me just add that a 15-minute assessment may be very appropriate when I'm trying to determine something on a kindergarten student, but certainly would not be appropriate when I'm thinking about math analysis, for instance. And how often is the test given? And do they give it as a computer-based test or on paper, or is it oral, or is it a project that the students provide? And here is the timeline. I already mentioned it. We sent that template out to districts on December 19th after getting some input from a few districts as to whether or not they thought that we have included the right things in the template. And they will return that, as I mentioned, later this month. We will summarize those results, and then we will provide it as a summary and also district by district, and that will be available at the beginning of the 2015 legislative session.
Questions? Questions?
I yield to Senator Montford.
Senator Montford?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner, when we get that information back, what will we do with it? I guess, I mean, I have a pretty good idea of what's going to come back. And so what will we do with it? And what can we in this legislative session do to have a significant positive impact on what we're facing this year? I mean, as you know, we're in the second semester already. We're gearing up. We're hunkering down. And so what will we do with it?
I don't think, Senator Montford, that there's going to be the opportunity for something to change for this school year, but it certainly does inform the legislature if they want to make legislative changes in order to better control what is happening in districts and make some decisions.
Real quick, if I may just talk just about the end-of-course exams just for a moment. I know we've been working on them. I know Hillsborough County has been working on them for 15 years maybe. Now, they're unique. But if you put that one aside and look at all of the other districts, we have spent a lot of money on end-of-course exams. Can you tell us where we are with end-of-course exams and just an idea of how much money this state has spent already on end-of-course exams?
Chairman, if I may, I don't know that we were prepared today to provide you with that information. We have, in the test item bank, there are items for district use, if they so choose. In those, we contracted for development of those courses that are what we would think of as being the main core courses that are not assessed by the statewide assessments. And then in addition to that, there were grant dollars that were provided to districts to work together to develop for what we called hard to measure. And those were mainly PE, foreign language, art and music. And then beyond that, districts have come together, and as they have developed assessments or items, they have submitted those into the item bank for use. It was developed with Race to the Top dollars, and those are there and available. And as I mentioned on the other slide, they have begun using those in districts now.
Senator Gates?
This has been very helpful today, Commissioner, and thank you for your patience with those of us legislators who tune into these issues. When we hear about them, you live with them every day. But, Mr. Chairman, I have to admit that I'm concerned. Here's what I've learned today. We don't know how much time is consumed by state-mandated tests. We don't know how much money it costs to perform state-mandated tests. We don't know whether tests that are performed by state mandate are valid and reliable. We're told that we need more legislative authority to make a qualitative assessment. That troubles me as somebody who believes in measurement and believes in accountability. We've learned today that we have no contingency plan if there are problems with statewide assessments. And I dare say, unless the Commissioner can disabuse us, we have not beta tested statewide assessments. We have learned from Senator Montford's colloquy with the Commissioner that timing has overtaken us. We're going to get a report back before the end of session. about surveys. We got a committee that's been initiated and going to start meeting. But we have school districts around the state that are beginning a testing schedule long before this other information will come in. And so now we're told that we really can't have much effect on this year. And so, Commissioner, where I'm back to is my DNA is all over the accountability legislation this legislature has passed. I take responsibility for a good bit of it. But Governor Bush has said, and there ain't anybody a stronger advocate and disciple and champion of accountability than Jeb Bush. He said we need fewer tests and we need better tests. And so given the things that we don't know and the time that's overtaken us, are we headed in the direction of fewer tests and better tests? And if so, when will we get there?
In order to have fewer tests, it'll take legislative change, and I'm happy to implement that. I'd like to say that I want to point out that when we moved to FCAT, we had no contingency plan. When we moved from FCAT to FCAT 2.0, we had no contingency plan. I would suggest to you that we have what we would call beta testing that has been done, and I'm happy to work with this legislature. All of you work with this committee. If you feel that in the legislation, those end-of-course assessments need to be standardized across the state, I am happy to work with the legislature on doing that, and we can even draft up some language to do that.
Can you, before we end your section, can you give me your thoughts on where we're proceeding on this, as we go to this implement, as President Gates has said, there is a significant number of concerns out here. Members of this committee obviously have some significant concerns going forward. What I'm hearing you tell me, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, is that you need legislative direction. Or do you feel as though the current statutes, as they provide now, provide you with ample implementation authority to ensure that we have a smooth assessment year and assessment year going forward without the number of assessments being out there that we're hearing from our constituents?
Chair, I would suggest to you that we're going to have a smooth transition with regard to the Florida Standards Assessment. And those assessments that we're continuing on with that were already in place, such as the biology and the U.S. history. We're going to have a smooth transition with those things. As far as what you're hearing about too much testing, that will, as I said, that would take legislative change in order for us to move forward and that to change. One last thing I want to point out is that I may have misrepresented what I said earlier. We'll have the information at the beginning of session, not at the end of session.
Final questions for the commissioner? Senator Dieter?
More or less a statement. I mean, what we've all done here today is outline the problem, and that's always step one, is identify the problem, but none of us have identified the solution. And I just wouldn't like to end the day with the commissioner thinking that we think it's her fault. I think you're a great commissioner. I always say half of the time when there's a problem and you're looking for the culprit, look in the mirror, it's us. We passed all these laws and then we call you in to yell at you. I mean, it's almost ludicrous. So I think we just need to work together for a solution. I think you've been very patient with us. The anger and frustration comes from what we hear in the public, and we understand that. And conversely, I don't see why it's a crazy idea that you take a course and you take a test on every single course every single year. This is not a bizarre notion. It's how we all grew up, and the world didn't come to an end. So I think if we need to make some legislative changes to make all of this make common sense to the average person, I'm happy to work with you on that.
Madam Vice Chair, you will have your opportunity this session. So, Senator Mofford.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wouldn't want us meeting to close without the commission having an opportunity to address two issues. One, Senator Gates brought up this morning, that was this whole move to opt out. Already school districts are receiving letters from parents wanting to opt out of the assessment. And so the school district got to have some kind of, I hope, consistent direction. And I know, and we've talked about that, and I know, but I think it would be good, maybe just, if you would, just touch on what that is. And the other issue that's looming out there is the whole issue of technology, what may be the lack of technology that exists in school districts to really implement what we're facing this year. And so, Commissioner, if you could just touch on that.
I'm happy to, and let me say in response to Vice Chair Dietert's comment, I'm happy to work with the legislature on some ways that we can have a common sense approach and think about the ways for us to do that. But I do believe that, as you said, it is important for us to have that baseline information, both here at this committee meeting, as well as the information that we are going to be receiving from districts. But to the opt-out question, Chair Gates has asked for a written response. I have in one of my slides that it is statewide assessment is mandatory, and there is one exemption opportunity, and that is for those students with medical complexities. And so the notion of opting out is a misnomer, but we're happy to provide that response in writing to Senator Gates in a very thorough manner, and we'll provide it to this committee too if you would like, Chair Legg. We're happy to do that. In response to the technology, I think that it is important for us. We know that it is a challenge for districts to have a one-to-one opportunity for that period of time where computer-based testing is given. That would certainly be a challenge. And that would be the way to get there by 17-18, is to ensure that in those tested grade levels, there's a computer for every single student, at least during that window period. And I think that we all, those of us here today, as well as educators throughout the state, need to examine whether or not that's the direction we believe is the right direction to move, and not for computer-based testing. But if it's the direction we need to move for our students to be ready to enter the world of work today. And I would suggest to you that we can have enhanced instruction with technology used appropriately. After this morning's meeting, we went back and we looked at what would the cost be for us to administer the assessments statewide as paper-based. And it's around $40 million each year in order for us to be able to produce the assessments in grades 3 through 11, 3 through 8 in math, and for the EOCs, to do so on paper. And if that's the direction we want to go, that's certainly something that the legislature could do and appropriate. Or we can look at the systematic way for us to get where we believe, whatever that is, what we believe to be from the technology standpoint. Districts have certified to us for the 13-14 year that they were ready for computer-based testing, and they did in fact administer those tests on computer. Were there situations where students were shown movies during the period of time, maybe 20 days? That is inappropriate. We need to find a way, and I believe that we need to find a way that every single day, those 900 hours that Senator Bullard talked about, every minute of those 900 hours that we can provide instruction to students needs to be provided. And so how do we get there? And again, going back to Vice Chair Dietert's comment, I am happy to work with this committee and anyone in the legislature to see how we can get there.
Commissioner, thank you. I'm sure we'll be talking to you and be working with you over the next several months.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. We do have some members of the public who traveled up here to give us their feedback and their comments. First, we have Deidre Clemens.
Hi, I'm from Collier County.
Recognize.
Thanks for letting me come and speak to you. I always ask my 16-year-old daughter what she did in school, and one day she said in chemistry and math, she sat in gym because other kids were taking the PSAT test, so the teacher was unavailable, the room was unavailable. So to me, the solution to a lot of this is a paper test. You're not in a special room, you're in the same room that you take your class in, and it doesn't interfere with anybody else's class time. Anyway, if you have one wheel on an axle, nothing happens. If you have two, it works really good, but if you had 3, 4, 5, 6, it's overkill. And that's what's happened with this, is layer upon layer of bureaucratic hoops that everyone has to jump through until it becomes a tragic comedy and damages learning and teaching and learners and teachers. So let me tell you how we used to do it, because it's really common sense and it's really simple. Because right now, you're not giving parents or teachers any credit. You're treating them like, shut up, sit down, we're going to take care of it, we're all control freaks up here. We're parents, we have families, we know what needs to be done. When you teach a course, there's a quiz at the end of every chapter. And then at the end of every semester, you take a test. It usually comes with the book. And it's predicated on the knowledge in that particular book that was chosen for that course. That's why you can't go to a one state test for everybody in the whole state. There are different books, there are good books, there are all kinds of books. That way you no longer interrupt that class period. You take the pen and the paper, and it's just for that 45 minutes. It's not 3 days, 4 days, 4 hours, 5 hours. And then if you want to test how we rate with everybody else, you get one of those Iowa, standard tests. And then we can see where we compare nationally, regionally, and you do it once a year. You don't need to do it every 6 months, every 3 months. And then as far as looking at the teacher, why don't we go back to using personal observation to evaluate teachers? Give them a break. Some are really good with the paper stuff. Some are really good with the vocal thing. Some are really good with the visual. You're killing the love of learning and creativity for kids. You're killing the love of teaching and creativity for teachers. And you're killing publishing. There's a lot of great books out there. So this type of bureaucratic control, it's a nightmare for everyone, as you've all admitted. So if you don't fix it, you're going to drive the public to alternatives to public education, which is a shame because all of our tax dollars are paying for it. And I would like to have my kids in the school with their neighborhoods, with their neighbors. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Chris Quackenbush.
Well, Deirdre and I are buddies. She has 10 children. Just wanted you to know that. So she has plenty of experience about what she's talking about. I'm a grandma. I graduated in 1964. It's not often you get a woman who will admit it. And I did very well in school, in spite of the fact that there were no state standards. There were no state tests. There was a couple of tests that we took, the Iowa Basics, something like that, perhaps a couple of times during my school years. I was a National Merit semifinalist. Somehow I managed without all that testing. It's important for us to recognize there are results that we can measure, and we should be looking at those results. Accountability is what you're looking for. So how has it worked over this period of time? And I have a chart, which I will leave here for your copying for each of the committee members. This is from the Cato Institute. This hockey stick graph shows the cost of education versus the results of education. The line at the bottom, which has not changed since pretty much the dawn of time, is the results. No matter what we do, we can't push that noodle up the hill any faster by measuring it. There's a point at which measuring becomes an obsession, and it needs to be stopped. So, as an example, it makes sense. Accountability is good, but only to a certain degree, only to the scope of attainable expectations. For instance, if I have a 5-foot person and I reward them millions of dollars to beat a 7-foot-tall NBA basketball player.
Ms. Quackenbush, if you can wrap this up, you about 30 seconds.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your time. We want to revert to an older time. We have been working on a bill for the last 6 months. We think we have the answer. We have a path, and we'd like to talk to you all about the answers that we have. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you very much. With that, seeing no further business before this committee, without objections, Senator Galvano moves we rise.